If you grew up in the American West, there's a fair chance that you have heard, and maybe continue to hear, grumblings about how newcomers have somehow ruined your community. Often Californians were and are the boogeyman's scapegoat for concerns over population growth and perceived attendant problems. For many Western communities in recent years, one of the most challenging such problems is housing affordability. This forces us to ask, as journalist Jonathan Bach does in his new book, High Desert, Higher Costs, Bend and the Housing Crisis in the American West, who gets to live in the American West? Or, more pointedly, who can afford to? Welcome to Writing Westward. I'm your host, Brendan Rensing. This is a topic that we've touched on in some previous episodes, and so now we offer an update as housing crises have continued to worsen in countless Western communities. This is a real and complex problem that demands careful study. Thanks for listening. Writing Westward is a monthly podcast featuring conversations with authors from various disciplines who are writing about the North American West. It is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University, where I, Brendan Rensink, am Associate Director and a Professor of History. My goal as host is for these conversations to spark your curiosity about and interest in thinking more deeply about the region's lands, cultures, and peoples in the past and present. This is a one-man operation, with me serving as host, producer, sound engineer, and everything else, all roles for which I have zero training. But I am trying to make up for that with my passion about the North American West, and I'll take any excuse to read more about it and talk to interesting people who are writing about the region. If a guest intrigues you, you can find links to their work in the show notes or at writingwestward.org. This podcast isn't monetized, so I'm not chasing subscriber stats for gain, but increasing the visibility of the podcast will help promote the works of our excellent guests. So please pause now to subscribe on whatever app you're using, write a review, follow us on Facebook or Blue Sky and leave comments, and share episodes with your friends, family, and colleagues. At the end of the episode, I will include some more information on my own scholarship and the Redd Center, our programming and projects, and funding opportunities that you could apply for. And with that, let me introduce who we're talking to this month and why. Jonathan Bach is a journalist and staff reporter covering housing and commercial real estate at the Portland, Oregon newspaper, The Oregonian. He holds a bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Oregon and has also reported for the Statesman Journal in Salem and the Portland Business Journal. Awards for his work include being a runner-up in 2019 and later winning in 2021 a Northwest Excellence in Journalism Contest Award, and being an 2021 honorable mention from the Society for Advancing Business Editing and Writing Best Business Award. In 2025, he was shortlisted for a Best Book Award by the SABEW for his book, High Desert, Higher Costs, Bend and the Housing Crisis in the American West, published in 2025 by Oregon State University Press. This is the topic of our discussion this month. In High Desert, Higher Costs, Bach traces the recent history of urban and suburban growth in Bend, Oregon, the causes and consequences of its affordability housing crisis, various measures the state and community have taken to address it, as well as some broader comparative points with other Western communities facing similar challenges. Enjoying the higher word count and longer turnaround a book offers compared to a newspaper article, Bach is able to trace the community, various trends, and specific people's stories across years. He highlights tensions in Bend that resonate with many Western cities. The road is bumpy from the collisions between rapid population growth and the slowness of housing development, between existing economies and new forms of recreation, tourism, and amenities economies, between existing communities and newcomers, and so forth. Bach's writing is clear, and the human stories embedded in the narratives of Bend's growing pains are compelling. While he avoids attempting easy solutions for housing affordability and supply crises in Bend and across the West, because there are no easy solutions, his examination of policies and programs that the city and state of Oregon have pursued do point towards potentially productive models that other communities in the West would benefit from considering. This is really important work, addressing a contemporary and legitimate crisis that plagues the American West, and modeling how to carefully examine what are often very complex situations with no easy solutions. and around discourse that is often more loud than productive. Jonathan Bach, welcome to Writing Westward.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm excited to talk about your book, To Get Back Up to the Pacific Northwest. Although, as I look over my list of books, it probably hasn't been that long since I've been up there. But really excited to kind of revisit a topic that we've done with a couple other episodes about affordability issues in the West, which is a growing problem.
Certainly.
Could you tell us a little bit about your personal history and relationship with the region?
Yeah, so I grew up in a lot of different places across the US West with a short detour to Mississippi. Born in California, Los Angeles area. And then my family lived in Montana, in Arizona, and then for much of my childhood in Oregon, in the Bend area. And that's where this book is centered. That's the sort of setting of high desert, higher costs.
So when you were in Montana, Arizona, the places, was it urban or rural West?
It was actually pretty rural. So I live in the Portland metro right now, which is sort of big city living. And it's a little bit strange for me compared to how I grew up because when we lived in Montana, for instance, we lived sort of outside Billings, so we obviously went into Billings, pretty frequently, and my mom worked in the city. But we where our house was up on this like really rocky sort of hilly area outside of town, and it was in this just beautiful overlook of like you just look out for miles and miles and miles and you see nothing but sort of craggy nothing. And that was emblematic of my parents really loved to live out in the sticks. They were both born and raised in the Los Angeles area, and they wanted to, live in more rural reaches when they raised their kids.
So is that how you think of the West as a region? Like when people talk about the West and or Western identity, Western geography, what are the landscapes or some of those cultural ideas? Are they rooted to the kind of that rural experience, or because per capita the West is the most urban region in the United States, but that's not how anyone thinks about it.
I think, I don't want to generalize my own experience to sort of everybody else's experience, certainly not sort of anecdata. How I, however, conceptualize the West just for my own sort of, inner picture is a lot of my growing up, which was in these rentals. We never owned a house. My parents never owned a house until I moved out and went to college and got a job. Was these sort of rentals in, sort of dusty areas, again, outside Billings, outside Kingman, Arizona. We did live in Lake Havasu, Arizona, and lived in Prescott.
Those are all very dusty countries, though.
Exactly, very hot. But when I think of the West, I think of space, I think of, open panoramas and certainly there's a lot there to unpack in terms of how sort of modern folks think of the West and sort of romanticize it, but just based on my very short time on this earth, that's sort of how I conceptualize it. But again, I don't want to generalize my own experience uh, to a definition of the U.S. West.
I think that's instructive, though, because here we have this book about urban and suburban spaces, and it's a book pitched as, I mean, American West is in the subtitle, right?
Mhm.
Um, so I think it's important for listeners to know kind of where you're coming from, and that you are a suburbanite now, but you've lived in some rural space. You've lived in a pretty good variety of Montana, Arizona, yeah, a lot of different kinds of places in the West.
Mhm.
I think that's useful to know. So you go to college, you get a degree in journalism. What leads you on this path then to focus your journalism on housing and commercial real estate, and then specifically kind of regional housing issues?
Mhm. Yeah, so I've covered housing for about 10 years at a variety of Oregon newspapers. I started at the Statesman Journal newspaper in Salem, which is our capital city. And when I started the Statesman, not to go into too much sort of boring biography, but I was our city hall and business reporter. And a lot of the time that meant I was writing about new development, new projects that were coming, new apartments, new businesses. And it was really interesting because you would see this sort of confluence of developers going to city hall for grants and loans. And I really was fascinated by the sort of intersection of private interests and public money and how those two are leveraged to build new homes um or sometimes projects don't work out. And so I worked at the Statesman for a few years. Then my wife and I moved up to Portland in 2020, and the world quickly shut down. We moved to Portland literally in January 2020, and within a few months, the publisher of the Portland Business Journal, which is a business weekly, headquartered in downtown Portland. It's right by Pioneer Courthouse Square. If you're familiar with
Mhm.
Portland, it's this beautiful sort of sunny square surrounded by skyscrapers. And so within a few months, the publisher gathered us all in the newsroom and said, "You're all going home, and you're going to work for home for, again, like maybe a few weeks or a very short time." That
We were
obviously,
so naive, so young, so
right?
naive.
We were so naive, and so I was hired at the PBJ as a real estate reporter. Worked there for, almost 4 years, and then I moved over to the Oregonian, where I cover housing and commercial real estate. But the reason that I love housing, particularly as a sort of topic area, as a beat, is that housing is one of the main ways that Americans build wealth under our sort of capitalist system. It's how we generate retirement savings in a country where the social safety net is, worn incredibly thin, or has been woven, you could say, incredibly thin. It's what a lot of Americans rely on for there as sort of a backstop, and if they have emergencies, they pull home equity loans, and I find that really, um, a rich vein of research and stories in just day-to-day reporting at the Oregonian, but then also for this sort of longer reporting project that was high desert, higher costs.
That's fascinating that our housing is not just where we live day by day, but you're right, it has so much broader impact. I mean, it's the kind of the primary driver of intergenerational wealth. It's often the inheritance that's passed down, and that builds generation over generation. So it has really big social and economic impacts beyond just having a roof over your head. So, I see articles regularly about, is this new generation going to be the rental generation, or are they going to be able to be homeowners or not? And that's something that we probably need to take a little more seriously than we do, which, your work is forcing us to reckon with. So before we dive into your book about Bend, Oregon, is there anything else kind of about housing costs and affordability in the West that you think we need to keep on the top of mind beyond what I think there is a general awareness in a lot of areas of the West about affordability issues? Is there any kind of big things that we need to have at the forefront of thought as we discuss?
Yeah, I mean, I think that particularly for us Westerners, the big question is land, right? And how do we caretake for the land? What do we do with these wide open spaces that we have here in the West that's maybe a little bit different from our East Coast uh, friends on the Eastern Seaboard? There have been proposals to turn massive swaths of land into housing, and certainly, one of the sort of thrusts of the book is, and from economists and other experts, is that we don't have enough housing in these communities, these Western communities, for the population gains that are expected, both sort of presently and then into the future. So we do need to build more. But the question is, like, how do we balance that against our responsibilities to not sort of overbuild and, drive out species that rely on the land, because once you build something, once you build over shrubs and wildlife habitats and all that, like, that land is that's gone. So that's a central tension that the book tries to explore, probably imperfectly, I'll definitely concede, but I tried to sort of get at that idea a little bit more than, other amazing books that have been written on the sort of housing crunch did, because of the fact that it's such a central tension for sort of, more rural communities in the US West.
There's just an article about a local movement here, this proposal to take public lands, turn them over to the states, but then the states were gonna then use the public lands for housing development. Um, and the question that wasn't mentioned anywhere in the article was like, "Well, where's the water come from all this new, development?" And, who knows? Um, well, can you give us a little bit of information about, Bend, Oregon, in terms of, its geography and economy, uh, and some of the culture? So, thinking about, like, the early days of white settlement, what built Bend up in that early development era?
So, Bend really came about in terms of its sort of white settler, foundation in the sort of late 1800s, early 1900s. Folks came over on wagon trains and they used similar paths that, native communities had known about for a long time. Um, and so you had the um the beginning of Bend was, in the early 1900s, and it really was driven in those early days by uh trains and by lumber, by sort of extraction economies. um it was a extraordinarily small town, just a few hundred people. Over time, you had the lumber economy build up, build up, build up, like a lot of Oregon towns. You see it on the coast, you see it in Central Oregon. And as time passed, you also had this sort of nascent tourism economy building up because you are right by the Cascade Mountain range that sort of cuts down from British Columbia all the way to Northern California. Bend is sort of pushed up right against the Cascades with like Mount Bachelor and the Three Sisters. And so you had this town that over the course of, 100 years, really relied on, again, both that extraction economy with the lumber, but also the, in a growing sense, that tourism economy where you were drawing folks in. And it was also, again, sort of the middle of the century, it became one of the fastest growing communities in Oregon and then in the nation.
And then, of course, move a couple decades later, and a lot of the lumber industries really collapse.
Hmm.
But Bend had this growing recreation tourism economy to not directly replace it, but to supplement that downturn in some ways. But what I think some Westerners, when they look at maps, there are certain assumptions we assign to different regions. And where Bend is located, high desert, interior Pacific Northwest, not coastal, like in the rain shadow. It's the seemingly kind of empty country with not very many large cities. It's dry. I
Juniper
think
and
people,
sagebrush.
yeah, this kind of Great Basin nothingness,
Yeah.
I think is what people have in their minds. I don't think they think of it as a region that would have a large amenity economy, attracting people for tourism or recreation. And they'd be surprised to hear, I think many will be surprised to hear that Bend, Oregon, of all places in Oregon, actually, well, maybe there's housing crises everywhere in Oregon, but I think they might assume that I bet it's fine out there in Bend. It's probably the coast cities, like Portland or, up farther like Seattle. Of course, they have a housing crisis, but interior Bend wouldn't. So can you disabuse us a little further of some of those incorrect assumptions about what the geography and climate is like in that it does attract people? People do want to live there because it's a fun, recreation full place to live.
I mean, I think so, not to throw my wife under the bus, but when we drive from the valley, which is, verdant and leafy and wet and damp and great for your skin, uh, when we drive over the pass and we go into the high desert and the flat, dry, you know, absolutely just suck every piece of moisture from your skin, high desert. When I get there, I'm like, I breathe it in and I just like, I can smell, it's just this feeling inside, this like intrinsic feeling of home. And when McKenna, my wife, is sitting in the passenger seat next to me, she's like, my lips are about to fall off because they're so dry. So just to give you a sense of like the juxtaposition of the Willamette Valley versus Bend, it's truly two different biomes, but tourists and residents are drawn to it because you have such a strong skiing and mountain biking and beer scene. Deschutes Brewery is located there because we had, the brew pub bill that was passed in the 80s that allowed brewers to brew beer on site and then sell it. And Oregon has an extraordinarily vibrant beer economy, and Bend is a key part of that. You can find Deschutes Brewery beer all over the U.S. So it's just become sort of a live work play city more so than, even when I was a kid in like the early 2000s, like, 2000, 2001, where it felt like a truck stop town, truly. Like, and, I talked to, Senator Tim Knope, and he, who he's a former senator, state senator, and when I spoke with him, he grew up even a few decades before that, and he's like, I remember that when there was just like one stoplight, it truly is a city that has undergone this transformation from a truck stop and lumber town to one that has doubled down on amenitization of nature, on instead of I think Ryan Pilgrim puts it really well in her book, Pushed Out, about community in Idaho, where it's like the trees are no longer valued for their sort of product value in terms of cutting them down and selling them. They're valued instead for their sort of amenity value for being, recreational and, recreational sightseeing. And I think that's really exemplified by places like Sun River, which is a resort town where my family and I used to live. And my sister and I worked housekeeping just for fun money, not for, we weren't, helping our parents pay bills or anything. We just did it for some, weekend cash. But my sister and I worked housekeeping at the resort, and it's this village almost of just golf courses and horseback riding and beautiful sunsets on the mountains. And the lodge at Sun River is this glassy wooden sort of lodge that overlooks just stunning sinking sunsets into the Cascade Mountain range, amenitizing those gorgeous views that you can only get in Central Oregon. And a lot of
Yeah.
people are drawn from far and wide to see that.
Yeah. I mean, it's a new kind of extractive industry with recreational experience or quality of life as the resource that's being extracted from the landscape. And it's a finite resource in a way, which is something, you get to in your book, as these places get crowded, as there's more and more development, as you sacrifice hinterlands that used to have trails and stuff, and now it's housing developments, you're uh, actually getting rid of some of the very amenities that were drawing people in. And that's another one of these tensions that you try to balance throughout the book. So this growth in Bend happens very quickly, even within your lifetime. Um, you write that in around 2016, it hits something of a tipping point where the demand for housing outpaces. And what I find interesting, you say it doesn't just outpace the supply of housing, it outpaced appropriate supply. So, what was the kind of housing that was being built, say, in the 80s, 90s, aughts, versus what was then actually needed come 2016? Like, what was the housing that did exist, and then the kinds of housing that did not exist but needed to?
Yeah, so to set the scene, 2016, you're in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. Deschutes County was one of the hardest hit. Deschutes County, which is where Bend is located. Deschutes County was one of the hardest hit counties in the US for economic pain during the Great Recession. It's a boom bust economy that heavily relied on construction workers, and a lot of construction workers lost their jobs. There was a lot of housing developments that just, you would drive around town during '08 and like they would just be basically half done. Um, and so
So that's because you had been enjoying a huge growth boom and had more and more of the economy kind of become dependent on everything about that constant, endless growth. It ends, and that's a huge chunk of the economy gone then.
And you have sort of like population gain steady over time, right? But '08 comes around and housing production absolutely plummets. So as population sort of, took a hit as well during that financial crisis period. But the problem is that post '08, and we see this in a lot of communities across the US as well, post '08, particularly in Bend, very popular Bend, population in, we'll say, like, 2010, 2012 onward into 2016, 2017, and then certainly into 2020 and beyond, continued to really, really come back with a vengeance, but home building did not. You had a weakened construction force. You had sort of more difficult, getting projects over the line, financially feasible. And so there were reports that were put out by the city, and then also this company, this economics firm called Echo Northwest, that said, okay, how can we solve this issue? Like, what are some ideas that we can throw against the wall? Well, first off, Bend needs more housing for these people who are coming in, who are seeing, who are delighting in post 2008 Bend, because the population is rebounding. But also, we need to kind of rethink the kind of homes that we're building. And this is answering your question. So, the mix of construction was largely single family detached in Bend up to now. It made up about 70% of sort of production. What city officials and these analysts at Echo Northwest were saying what Bend really needs is sort of what's called middle housing, or like townhomes, triplexes, duplexes, in order to and then more apartments, in order to accommodate folks who are retiring and who want to sell their house and move into something that's maybe, smaller and more fits their lifestyle sort of post retirement, or for folks who are young couples who are moving into Bend but need a starter home. These sort of shifting demographics of Bend that are flooding into the city. It's a hard shift though, because like when you think of, going back to our conversation about like what do you think of when you think of the West, I think a lot of people, I don't want to make generalizations, but I think, a lot of your listeners might agree that when we think of living in the West, we think of wide open spaces. And also, for a lot of people, that means like a single family house with a big lot, or on, some acreage. It doesn't necessarily mean to them like living in a townhome. Um, and it's a hard shift. It's a hard sort of mentality shift. Um, but in order to sort of preserve that land that we're talking about within, the what's called the urban growth boundary, in order to not build out super far, officials and experts were trying to figure out, okay, what are some denser housing options that we can offer up?
The problem, of course, though, is that there's going to be a lag. They might come to a decision, but then to actually get projects finished and people moving in, that's potentially years. So this is already a problem by the mid 2010s. What does this new era of increased remote work, which then is accelerated, but with COVID and a lot of people being forced to work remotely, and then realizing, oh, I can work from wherever, so I might as well move somewhere fun. And they moved to places, like Bozeman, Montana,
Hmm.
or places in Idaho or Oregon that previously had not seen huge influxes of, outsiders moving in. Suddenly do have people buying up all the properties. Um, how does that play out in Bend then? I guess, over the last, like, 6 years.
Yeah. I mean, this is what was termed the Zoom town. People
Yeah.
probably saw a lot of headlines about Zoom towns during COVID. You know, you had city folk who were moving into smaller towns because they had been sort of unleashed from their laptops or from their desks, and they could now work anywhere. They could work from anywhere, and you know, as long as they were checking into Slack or Teams, then it didn't really matter where they were, you know, where they bought a house. So the interesting thing about Bend particularly was that it was actually even before COVID, you know, census data shows that it was one of the sort of highest telecommuting cities
Mm.
in the US already, but COVID just sort of put fuel on that. So you have even more folks coming into the city because once again, like all those amenities, you know, that great beer, mountain biking. It's like, why wouldn't I clock into work, you know, 8 to 5 and maybe sneak out for, you know, a run in the woods or, you know, a bike ride or, you know, hit the slopes after work. Like, you know, that compared to, you know, getting on the subway and, you know, trudging back to my, you know, 2 square foot apartment, like, you know, there's there are certainly choices that I think folks made. I love subways just as much as the next person, first off. Uh, I really love public transit systems. But it's, you know, it put fuel on that. And then other, you know, cities that I looked at, like Bozeman and Boise, not just because they are
And
alliterative,
Boulder, you did all the
and
Bs.
Boulder, yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, also had that sort of Zoom town happen as well. Because again, you've got these amenities.
I grew up in Bellingham, Washington, another B town. My parents still live there, and I laugh at how regularly they're talking about some new family that moved into the city and, like, goes to their church congregation. I'm like, "Oh, what do they do?" And they're like, they work remotely, but the dad just moved here for the mountain biking." Like, large numbers of people that they have met at church are just people who wanted to mountain bike, and Bellingham is a great mountain bike town. So maybe it is just a problem with towns that start with B. Maybe that's a follow-up piece you need to work on. Um, how does kind of concurrently with all this, I mean, all these problems are all compounding on one another. We also see a rise at the same time period of investors buying properties, maybe as vacation or secondary homes for themselves, or especially after that huge crash in 2008 when prices did go down, the people that did have money were able to go in and purchase up properties and then rent them out. And does that just kind of compound these problems in very similar ways?
Yeah, in terms of like short-term rentals or rental properties or
Yeah, I mean, and you do write about, I mean, this is something I wanted to get to later, but let's talk about it now. Like, so Bend does realize, oh, we have a problem of short-term rentals, which are not serving the actual local residents who need long-term rentals. Like, they can't purchase homes, but they do want to rent long-term, and everything's just like Airbnb'd out. So, what are some of the policies? How did Bend city government grapple with that?
yeah, I mean it's sort of it's a central tension. You know, I remember I have this very distinct memory whenever I think of sort of Central Oregon Airbnbs. Is I was at my friend Pat's house in Sun River, and it was I think we were like hanging out watching a movie or something, and I was probably like 16, and I remember his mom, Chris, being like, "Oh yeah, you know, the people next door, you know, it's just an Airbnb and, you know, there's just snowboarders," something like that. And so whenever I think of like short-term rentals in Central Oregon, I think of uh his mom, Chris, just being like, "Ah, yeah, those snowboarders," in Sun River. But to your question, you know, one of the key things I wanted to find out was like, okay, so people really don't like short-term rentals. You know, I had some fun cruising through Reddit and seeing a lot of the really angry comments about there was this one person who was like, "Hey, you know, me and my girlfriend, we really love Bend and we're thinking about, you know, buying a property there just to rent out and then stay in, and oh my gosh, did this person get dogpiled. And then one of the
Not in
main
my
characters
backyard, right?
one of the main characters, David, who is sort of woven throughout the book, he sort of offered a pretty measured, response to this person, saying like, "You might wanna, just, anyways, I'll let folks read that section, but it was sort of indicative of the timbre of, the town mood toward Airbnbs. So I wanted to understand, okay, like, people don't like them, they are regulated, but, like, how much do they actually affect the housing stock in the city? I also talked to this gentleman named John Crom, who he's a real estate agent, and he, not only sells homes, but he, owns a few Airbnbs with his wife, or some short-term rentals with his wife. I don't know if he actually rents them out through Airbnb. And to just get a sense of, like, why do you do it? Like, what kind of blowback have you gotten from residents? And he also posts videos to YouTube where he sort of tries to give folks the lay of the real estate land in Bend. And he talks about his STR, his short-term rental journey, and some of the regulations that he's faced from Bend. So there's this one episode where he is holding up a placard that he got, or a little card that he got from the city of Bend, and he kind of puts his head in his hands and he's like, it's happening again. I'm paraphrasing. And basically, the city of Bend was instituting some new regulations. So I go to watch these city council meetings where city leaders are grappling with the question of, like, what do we do with, not only what do we do with these STRs, but how much are they actually affecting the housing stock? And the answer was sort of twofold. Um, Short-term rentals aren't really a huge as a share of the overall housing stock. They don't make up a ton. Um, they don't take up a ton of housing. On the flip side, as University of Oregon experts told me, it's like, every unit counts when you're in a housing crunch. So it's sort of I tried to present a more nuanced view of the short-term rental conversation than sort of black and white, like good guys, bad guys. It's like, the city is stepping in seemingly an appropriate way to try to regulate them by doing things like spacing out how close they can be to one another, creating buffer zones. But also, like, as one University of Oregon housing expert told me, it's like on the list of priorities that the city should be looking at, these might be a little bit lower down in terms of addressing their housing crunch.
But they're the ones that people are yelling about on Reddit, right? Or going to
Right.
city council meetings and yelling about. It's a more visible issue that gets people really worked up because, yeah, they have these darn snowboarders next door who are making, noise every night, right? I mean, my city council here, literally, for the last month or so, STRs have been a big part of the discussion because
Oh,
it
really?
turns
So what
out
does that
that
look, I'm just curious. So what's the conversation?
it turns out that, and I haven't been able to follow all of it as closely as I should, but there actually is a city ordinance that disallows certain kinds of STRs. I think specifically ones where you're not a resident. It's like you can rent out a basement if you're living in a house. You can have an STR in the basement, but if it's the entire house, there's something different. But then there's a state regulation which makes it so the city can't enforce that. And so the city for years just hasn't enforced it, but now is talking about maybe enforcing it. And people who, they bought a house specifically because it had an accessory apartment that they could Airbnb out and help them cover the mortgage are now like, am I suddenly going to be underwater on this mortgage? Uh,
That's fascinating.
yeah, it's super messy.
It's
Um,
also, I think that gets to a really key sort of conflict where some folks use the STR money as like supplemental income when it's somebody who's, living with them. So one of the main characters, I don't think she ended up doing this, but when I was talking with her in her dining room, she was looking at buying a house, sort of, toward a later part of the book, and she was saying, I think she was telling me at some point that they were, like, thinking of, we might, you know, rent out part of our house because the fact that it'll help us basically cover the mortgage because mortgages are so expensive. And that would presumably be through one of the ways you can do that is through an STR company,
Yeah.
which, might give you some semblance of, protection, compared to like a traditional landlord tenant agreement. But, I'm not a legal expert.
The other interesting wrinkle with STRs is that often the people that are coming and using them are tourists, are people who are bringing money into the local economy, and cutting that off could have potential negative side effects to the broader tourist economy, could it not? If suddenly it's harder for them to find places to stay? Or again, are the numbers kind of so small that it's not as significant of an issue as I might be thinking?
I think like any sort of industry, I mean, I'm a business reporter, and there's always these grapples between certainly like you think about like Uber versus the taxi industry. Like the taxi industry would very much rather that Uber didn't exist. Uber would be very happy to, and they have been largely successful in, driving out a lot of the taxi industry's market share. Hoteliers are not super big fans of short-term rentals and vice versa. Like, I think to that degree, it's largely just about, customers are going to be able to find places to stay if they're in Bend. It's just a matter of price, demand, and meeting that demand sort of by the laws of classical economics. But how that does or doesn't benefits either, a hotel company or an individual resident who, let's say, like, is living in some I go into some of the stats about, like, who are, out of town investors who own the SDRs, who reports as, like, living in town and stuff. Those are in the book, but it's like, if you're, let's say, an in-town resident who rents out an STR, I think it's a little bit different conversation than if you're somebody who lives out of state and has bought a STR and is renting it out. I think it's just a different kind of timbre of conversation and consideration.
Yeah, because it's where are those dollars ending up? Are they staying in the community or just going to some
Right.
some California or East Coast investor? I'm sure Californians are the villain in Bend. Like, they're the villains everywhere. It seems like everyone wants to blame all their problems on Californians moving in. It's like from when I was a kid in Washington to living in Utah now, it's always the Californians. Um, I wanna talk about a few of the, I don't wanna call them solutions because they haven't all panned out, but a few of the ideas that have been pursued, because this might be enlightening to people elsewhere in the West whose communities may be facing similar problems. You write about, the Stevens Road, area as, uh, a kind of like hinterland area, wooded with trails, that was then tagged as maybe the city builds price-controlled housing. How does that, work as a solution or not?
I think it's one of those really interesting, I sort of bridle at the idea of like solutions or not solutions, just because as a journalist, like I'm not an advocate. I'm not here to sort of be a booster for one group's idea or another, but I think it's also incumbent on us to try to, and this is in the school of what's called solutions journalism, funnily enough, but it's incumbent on us to try to also, if we're going to point out a problem, like try to see what's working and if there's some way to replicate that. Kind of like what you're saying. So, to your question about Stevens Road, so it's actually not far from where I used to live on near Rickard Road, but it's this sort of stretch of a few hundred acres, um, and it's a lot of, again, that sagebrush and juniper. We drove out there and kind of walked the trails because it's, even though it's sort of state property right now, or was state property when I was reporting the book. Um, there's sort of like there's a there's sort of a gate, and then it says, Department of State lands. But people just walk in there and they've made like makeshift bike trails and walking trails. We walked out there and saw like shotgun shells and anyways. So uh the idea was to do a essentially an emergency expansion of Bend's urban growth boundary. So, crash course in sort of Oregon land use law. We have what are known as urban growth boundaries around our cities, and these date back to the 1970s and Governor Tom McCall. And essentially, what they do
This
is,
SB 100,
yeah,
yeah, the state bill that tried to limit suburban sprawl.
exactly. And has largely been successful in doing that. I mean, we are not California. You can drive city to city and between, Portland and Salem and Eugene, you're largely looking at farmland. You're not looking at a bunch of sort of suburban tracks. With some exceptions, of course. So, the urban growth boundary, just for all intents and purposes, think of it like a ring around a city that gets sort of pushed out just a little bit every now and again, every few years, through a very arduous, contentious process that frequently gets appealed. Um, and so state lawmakers passed a bill to do essentially an emergency expansion outside of the normal process, the normal UGB expansion process, to bring the Stevens Road tract, about 250 acres, um, into Bend, and so that they could build, a mix of affordable, income restricted and private market housing, a few thousand units on that land. So again, it's that trade off of, okay, you've got a few hundred acres and it's, you know, trying to provide housing to, firefighters, teachers. These are the folks who always get cited, by lawmakers in these conversations. But, Bendites, locals. Is this a solution that's going to work? The housing hasn't been built yet. It's under development right now. I kind of check back every now and again on that project. Um, but I think one of the other things that sort of strikes me about Stevens Road is it takes so long for these projects to get built. We looked at a comparable neighborhood, Northwest Crossing, and that from ideation to actual build out of Northwest Crossing was like decades. And when I talked to the city, ask one of the city planners, asking them like, how long do you think it'll take for this whole thing to get built out? I mean, it was on a similar timeline. Certainly, there will be sort of units phased in over time, but the problem, one could argue, is now. But one thing I know covering housing is that, like, the housing doesn't go up in a day. You gotta put your financing together, you gotta get your architects, you gotta draw your blueprints, then you gotta get more financing together, then you gotta get your approvals, then you gotta get your permits, then you gotta get more approvals, then you get appealed, and then you get buy-in from neighbors, and then the neighbors don't like your project, so then they appeal it. Like, it is the slow machinery, that is not equipped to address a fast-moving, fast-growing problem.
So, any cities, be it the West or elsewhere, that have fast population growth, it's difficult to not be behind the eight ball constantly on housing supply. Not even getting into like the appropriate housing supply, for like working class people. Like, I mean, the example that always comes to mind that I probably even mentioned on a different episode is years ago. We're driving up through Jackson and we stop at a Subway or something, and there's this worker, some dude in his like I don't know mid-30s or something, and it hits me. I was like, where does this guy live? How does he afford to live in Teton County? And, I come to find out that a lot of them don't. Like, they live, like, 30, 45 minutes away, out in a mobile home. Uh, anyways, it's a real issue in terms of like, that working class problem.
Yeah, and I think, you've had a Billionaire Wilderness,
Yeah,
that
yeah, Justin
author.
Farrell, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he's got such a great book, right, about about that particular area.
So, the Stevens Road one, it demonstrates that even if a good idea is come up with, it's not just the bureaucracy, it's levels and levels of bureaucracy and appeals and court cases and environmental studies. There's just so much that slows a project down and might make it take for decades. Um, when you talk about middle housing solutions, and I think it was in late 20 teens, Bend passes, or no, maybe it was the state that passed a bill to kind of relax zoning for high density housing, right? So great, possible solution. But how long does it take to build a whole bunch of big apartment buildings or condos, especially if you have locals next door who are like, I do not want high density housing next door. This is what ripped my city apart over the last since we lived here for about a decade and high density housing. It's every single candidate. Are you for or against high density housing? That's what everyone asks, right? That's like the boogeyman. But at the same
Well,
time, they're all complaining about how, like, oh, our kids can't afford to live in a city. And like, well, what frustrates me here is that people, they say, we want the city to be for families, which they're implying is single family homes. I'm like, families live in apartments. So it's just this, what kinds of families, I think. I'm not going to get into my local politics. But what about, um, is the story in terms of timelines any different for, there's another example you bring up of, it's called LIFT, but it's the Local Innovation Fast Track. This is like state subsidies for building low income housing. And there's also federal low income housing tax credits. There's all these incentives to, at least on the financing side, try to accelerate these processes. Does it make them go any faster? Or has it in Bend? And you bring up it's the Rooted at Simpson and College View Apartments projects as some examples. Can you tell us about those?
yeah, so, twofold answer. I wanna return briefly to the middle housing, comments you made because I think those are so insightful, and I think, what's been really interesting with the the middle housing conversation is, Governor Tina Kotek, when she was House Speaker, she championed the middle housing bill, House Bill 2001, that sort of eased those regulations in single family neighborhoods to make way for townhomes, triplexes, duplexes. And what's been so fascinating to watch in the intervening 7 years is some communities in Oregon have really, really taken to building those. Portland is one of them. Like you know, those middle housing units make up a large share of our annual construction, according to a report that the city put out. In Bend too, if you look at the data, it's taking up an increasing share of construction. Again, certainly, it's not a perfect model, but it's been kind of encouraging to see that middle housing is taking off. Um, on a bit of an uneven in a bit of an uneven way, again, if you look across the state, but in some of these communities, um, certainly. In Portland, it's a little more complicated because we have so little construction right now for a variety of factors that it's like, a large share of a small amount of construction is still a small amount of construction. So, but I did wanna put that note in there about middle housing. To your question about sort of state and federal subsidies, there is an extraordinarily wonkish chapter about the LIFT program, and this was a program, it's called Local Innovation and Fast Track. It was sort of spearheaded in the 20 teens, and the idea was to just throw an extraordinary amount of subsidy at low income, income restricted housing to build an audacious amount of units to fill this need across the state. So we're talking like over the past 10 years, like hundreds of millions of dollars state lawmakers have approved in funding for the LIFT program. The idea behind it was to pair LIFT with and leverage is sort of a technical term, leverage LIFT money with what's known as the LIHTC, the Low Income Housing Tax Credit uh, program. I think I have that acronym right.
Yeah.
And that's a federal program that's been around since sort of the Reagan era. And in order to sort of supercharge the LIHTC, the way the developers that affordable housing developers can use LIHTC in Oregon. And in a lot of ways, they saw success with Lyft and pairing Lyft and LIHTC, using it as something like, kind of gap funding or leverage money to get a lot of affordable housing units off the ground. The thing that I thought was really interesting in reporting this, though, as a sort of demonstration of the rural urban divide, if you will, is that Bend did not get a lot of that lift subsidy. It certainly got some for sort of for sale homes, um, but not much in the way of rental homes until the 2020s. So you had this gap period where it's like Bend, which is the largest city in Central Oregon, a huge region in Oregon, with a demonstrated housing crisis. The question I pose is, it's like, why were state officials not doing more to promote this program to local developers? What was the disconnect there? Um, so that's just, again, Portland area developers were getting a ton of this money. Why was that not the case necessarily for Bend developers? Again, to be sure, uh, developers across the state were leveraging this funds, but it's something that in the course of researching this book, I was kind of scratching my head at. The developments that you pointed to, though, by a group by the name of Rooted Homes, these were more income restricted housing units that leveraged the lift dollars to offer sort of for sale options through what are known as community land trusts. We're throwing out a lot of terms here, a lot
As
of
you said, it was a wonky
it
chapter.
was a very wonky chapter. Enter at your own peril. But
Are these the
also,
kinds
like,
of discussions that your wife's eyes just glaze over when you start talking about tax credits and, um
these are the kinds of just as a very brief aside, like, Kim, who was the editor of this book, who just made the whole book sing. I mean, we went back and forth on this chapter and we got so lost. We're like, what is going on here? I mean, I had to rewrite this chapter several times because it got too sort of technical. And so what you read is a very smoothed out version, and
Okay.
we really tried to storyfy it. And I really like it because I'm a numbers nerd. I'm a business reporter. I get really into the technical policy stuff, but I feel like I'm doing a horrible job of selling this book right now. Uh,
No, no.
anyways, so
The book is a very easy read.
thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah. No,
So
I know for real though, it's evident this was written by a journalist because there are people, there are humans, there are stories, there's narratives in ways that if this book was maybe written by an economist, we would not see. So, like, your journalism storytelling comes through.
you're too
Mm,
kind.
yeah.
That's very nice. And I'm glad to hear that because truly the whole idea with this long-term project was to follow a group of people over the course of several years to get their stories sort of over a longer time than you can do in a quick turn newspaper story where you get the assignment at 9 a.m. and then you file the story by 3 p.m. So the Lyft money, returning to Lyft and community land trusts and LIHTC, basically, the Lyft money was able to fund these income restricted for sale homes in Bend that offer sort of another entryway into homeownership, um, that I think is, again, another potential solution for Bend's housing crisis. And we sort of walk through uh, the pros and cons of community land trusts, which, in short, you own the property, but a nonprofit owns the land underneath the home.
If we can zoom out a bit as we're running out of time, and I told you I wouldn't put you on the spot about anything weird, but here we go. Um, do you have a sense of how unique, say, like this Lyft program or that House bill that relaxed zoning codes to allow for more high density housing, are these tactics that lots of places around the West are taking to address their housing crises, or is this a Oregon only story?
I don't think this is an Oregon only story. I certainly think that Oregon is out front on a lot of these policies. I mean, Governor Kotek particularly has gotten a lot of acclaim for being a very staunch pro housing governor, first House Speaker and then governor. I cover her housing policies at the Oregonian, and we do a lot of reporting around we, the politics team and I, do reporting around her, sort of the outcomes of her policies. But to her credit, she has thrown a lot of ideas against the wall, and House Bill 2001 was one of the more aggressive policy maneuvers that I think set the tone for a lot of other communities across the West. And I think a lot of folks took notice of that one particularly. The Lyft program, won an award, uh, sort of a, just an industry award for being, really innovative. So I think that these are Oregon is an innovator, certainly, but also there are other communities that are looking because this is such a widespread problem, trying to figure out how to house workers, working class folks who make these cities run. Um, you look at Moab, you look at communities in Bozeman, in Boulder, which are, in the book, like everybody's looking for ways to fix this.
Their solutions are out there, and they may be messy and not always work, but, I mean, I don't know if you know much about Oregon's history in the progressive era, but, like, you guys have been at the forefront of, like, radical ideas and reforms, for a long time. It's been in your guys' blood for a while. Well, to kinda close up as we think about, I mean, you mentioned some of these other places like Moab, these, amenity tourism gateway communities that exist across the West, which are growing and the economies are benefiting from recreation and tourism or becoming retirement homes or vacation communities. But at the same time, so that's great for the economy, but it's a devil's bargain, right? Because it's those very things often create affordable housing crises. So, where do you think things stand now? Do you have any final, not to progress, to try to tell the future, but where do things stand and where do you think things are heading in the next, 5 or 10 years?
That's a great way to sum it up, sort of giving the sweep of these sort of different but similar communities. Bend is not Moab. Boulder is not Bozeman. All of these are really distinct communities with their own characteristics, their own communities, their own sort of profiles, their own residents. There are certainly similarities between their housing crises, but I think each one is having to grapple with its own version of the influx of newcomers and on a sort of sociological level, like how do you um, ease tensions between folks who have lived in a bend for a long time and people who are just coming in and maybe they're tech workers or maybe they're not tech workers, like maybe there's maybe they're teachers. I moved more times than I care to say, before I was a teenager. And so I'm pretty used to being a newcomer. And I think that one, beyond the housing element of this, it's really a story about the book is really about two things. It's about sort of wealth inequality and like who gets access to these spaces. But it's also a story about like who is like how people get along in these cities. There's I think one of the most sort of enlightening examples for me was this couple who they moved from the Portland area to Bend during the pandemic, and one of them was a tech worker, and the other person, the other member of the family was a teacher. And sort of the stereotype is, oh, all these tech workers coming into our city and, and are changing our city. But it's like, well, I mean, kind of, but also like the one of them is just a middle school teacher. Like she's, tying herself to the local economy, and her husband works for Blue Origin, so maybe not a tech company, aerospace company. He's an engineer. Like it is more, I think my point is like it's a more nuanced conversation, and I think that we owe it that sort of that deeper thought.
I mean, you name one of your final chapters, who gets to live in the American West, right? And this is something we need to sit with and think critically about. Well, to wrap up, Jonathan, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you're working on now or what you have coming in the future that we might look forward to?
Yeah, so I'm working on a few different book ideas. One of them, and may or may not pan out, but I'm kind of in the, a few, maybe around 30,000 words into an idea about working on, sort of how we um, care for our elders in America, sort of the caregiver crisis it's been called, and sort of the economics of that. So I'm trying to better understand, what elder care in America looks like.
You picked the easy topics. Wow. No, my wife and I, we've been talking about this a lot lately, because we've had some friends whose lives have been turned completely upside down with unexpected elder care demands, and no one in society is talking about it. Um, well, that's I wouldn't say that's great. It's a really hard topic, but I'm glad that you'll be tackling it. Well, congrats on this book, and your other reporting. You've won awards, which I described in the episode introduction, and so forth. Yeah, really great to talk to good journalists, who are working out here in the West and who are working in the West, not just parachuting in, but live here, work here, understand the place, and really care about it. So, and your care and passion for the region, it comes through in your writing, and that is a real big deciding factor for me when I'm reading through stuff like this. So,
I appreciate that.
and I appreciate you spending some time with us.
Yeah, no, it means a lot. I appreciate you inviting me on, and this is a great conversation. It's a lot of the sort of the radio hits are like pretty short, and this is such a great sort of long form, deep conversation. So
Yeah.
I mean, this wonderful podcast, like great format for a podcast, and really enjoyed listening to
Oh, well, I appreciate that. Thanks. I just like talking to interesting people. So, yeah.
it.
All right, Jonathan. Well, I hope you do well and take care.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you again for listening. You can find links to our guests' works in the show notes or at writingwestward.org. This podcast isn't monetized, so I'm not chasing subscriber stats for my own gain. But increasing the visibility of the podcast will help promote the works of our excellent guests. So please pause now to subscribe on whatever app you're using and write a review. Follow us on Facebook or Blue Sky and leave comments. And share episodes with your friends, family, and colleagues. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. We are an interdisciplinary research center that supports academic research and the promotion of public understanding of the North American West. We host regular public lectures, often live streaming them on our YouTube channel. We have an annual funding cycle with award, grant, and fellowship categories that nearly anyone can apply for if they are researching or working on the region from any disciplinary approach or towards any final product. Learn more at redcenter, reddcenter.byu.edu. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. His website is linked in the show notes. My name is Brendan Rensing, and I serve as the podcast host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and everything else for the podcast, so you can direct any praise, or more likely critiques, my way. I'm the author and editor of a number of books, articles, and chapters on the North American West, borderlands, native peoples, genocide studies, religion, the environment, and more. My recent titles include a 2018 book, Native But Foreign: Indigenous Immigrants and Refugees in the North American Borderlands, which won the Best Historical Nonfiction Book Award from the Western Writers of America. A 2019 anthology I co-edited with Jane Hafen, Essays on American Indian and Mormon History, which won the Metcalf Best Anthology Book Prize from the John Whitmer Historical Association, and a 2022 collection of essays I edited entitled The North American West in the 21st Century. I recently launched a new series with the University of New Mexico Press entitled The West in Context. Send me a note if you have a manuscript to propose for publication. Here at the Red Center, I'm also the general editor and project manager of a great digital public history project, Intermountain Histories. It is a free mobile app and website, intermountainhistories.org, that curates student-researched and written micro-histories of the region, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more that you can use remotely or on a road trip. To contact me about the podcast, my own research, the Red Center, or anything else, head to bwrensink, that's bwrensink.org. Email me at bwrensink@byu.edu, or follow me on Blue Sky at Brendan W. Rensink. Until next month, be well, be curious, be kind.